So hello all, I hope you're all well and having a great week. Tonight, Middlesex University Product Design Engineering and Design Engineering are really excited to host our 8th talk in the annual guest lecture series. So this series runs weekly throughout the academic year on Thursday evenings. We bring together a vibrant mix of speakers from across the full spectrum of design and engineering, a mix of leading practitioners, opinion leaders, radical thinkers, and emerging talents to inspire and support you guys. Tonight, we're really excited to host Jake Kraweckyj. He's a content and UX designer at Sage, and Jake's a UX and content writer. He's a designer. He lives in Manchester. He spent over 7 years as a professional writer, 4 of those as a UX writer for all sorts of different businesses in the UK and Australia as well. So Jake is great at making stuff that is really complex, really simple, and hopefully can inspire us to do the same as well. And as usual, guys, feel free to gather your thoughts, your comments, your questions in the chat throughout the talk. We'll have Q&A at the end, and there's also the opportunity to go live and interact with Jake as well, following the main talk. And without any further ado, over to Jake with a talk titled Wrong First Time.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, so let's get started. The reason I've called it Wrong First Time is because in UX, we're so used to focusing on sort of research and making sure that we get what we're creating in front of users, and it doesn't always meet the mark. That can kind of be a problem, which I'm going to sort of address a bit later. The questions you might ask yourself, the situations you might find yourself in straight after the research sessions, and things you can do to kind of alleviate some of those worries that you might have after being wrong first time. So I'll tell you a little bit more about me. So I grew up in North Manchester, hence the accent. I'm a fan of the 3 Cs: comedy, circuit training, and craft beer. Circuit training is a relatively new one in that lineup, but it's something I've really started to enjoy, especially as lockdowns have kind of eased. Before lockdown, I was living in Australia, in Melbourne specifically, working with ANZ, one of the top 4 banks there, one of the big 4, and with a consultancy agency called RXP, who worked with sort of various clients. I worked on their internal websites a little while I've been in the UK. So that should say 6+ years experience there. I mean, 5+ is technically 6, isn't it? So I've had mostly financial and accounting experience, and I specialize in natural language forms, user job stories, and empathy mapping within finance and accounting spaces, though I've done a little bit of academia and government work as well. So this applies to design and content, and to an extent research as well, but I've called it content because I'm coming from a content designer's perspective. So what it's like when content fails, especially the first time you're testing it, there are some feelings that you might have at that point, and I want to talk through those a little bit. You might feel demotivated. You might have thought that you knew your audience better than you do. You might feel frustrated because you feel like you've put a lot of work into it and it's just gone down the pan all of a sudden. You're worried now because you're looking at the scope of the work you've yet to do to fix this situation. And then you're stressed because on top of that, you've probably got some stakeholders who are less than happy at receiving negative feedback on their designs that they've approved, or that other designers have worked on with, and various stakeholders across the business or institution, wherever you seem to happen to work, they might have a problem, or they perceive to have a problem with it anyway. So these are some of the questions you might ask yourself, and substitute writer for designer or researcher in this situation, whichever works in your field. So am I a good writer? Do I really understand my audience? And are we ever going to get it right, so to speak? And the short answer to all of those is yes. Yes, you are. And the point of this presentation really is to help you ask questions of yourself and of your teammates in a healthier way, and get an idea of how much your work is actually valued within the company that you're working for. So we'll start at the very beginning and start to think how teams are put together and how UX teams usually work. And they seem to work in one of 2 ways usually, I've seen: in silos and something like agile. Luckily, we're not seeing so much the silo approach now, at least not like a voluntary silo approach. When I first started in UX writing, which is coming up to 6 years ago now, I was in 2016. I joined a UX writing team for a bank in the UK. it was basically like an assembly line. So the writers write, the designers design, the researchers research, and then the whole thing starts again once we've had a conversation with devs. But the problem with that is, of course, you can only sort of focus on the little part that you're focusing on. Not everything matches up. So you could write something, a wonderful piece of content that then has to be shoehorned into a design that then has to be sent off to researchers who will go and produce a dossier of what they presume are actually valid sort of user interactions, and everything feels like a big disconnect. And there's a pretty good reason for that, because you're all coming at it from different perspectives, all coming at it with different disciplines, and ending up at different sort of conclusions with slightly different goals too. So this is where something like Agile comes in and works better. Not perfectly, but works better. So writers pair right with designers. If you're not familiar with that term, that basically means you're actually sitting there with a designer, a writer and a UX designer are sitting together, or it could be a writer and researcher sitting together, hashing out exactly what appears on which page and what information a user has at certain points, what they need to know, what they need to know later, what they need to know before, all these different things. So it's a pretty symbiotic process. There's a big exchange of ideas, so designers can comment on the content, writers comment on the design. Research kind of comes in when they can. It's kind of like a little bubble that we kind of pull people in, from other areas into at certain points. So that's basically something like like those are the two ways I've seen generally UX teams are kind of lined up. And it's kind of the same at ANZ Australia. So in 2019, I moved over to Australia to one, sample the life out there, and two, find some UX work and sort of progress my career. I'd heard that UX was even a couple of years behind what was in the UK. So as luck would have it, I managed to get a 6-month contract with ANZ Bank Australia, and it was a big project as well. It was digitising the small business lending application process and creating something called the cash flow online application. So what this basically is a bit more than just digitizing a form, but it's digitizing the process. It used to be just a PDF. You'd print it off, you'd fill it in. If you're a small business, you'd print it off, fill it in, sign it, scan it, send it back to Melbourne's ANZ office, and you could get up to 2 weeks to get a conditional offer for a loan or overdraft. So you'd send them all your details on a slip of paper, scan it in, and just wait, basically. That's a big problem for small businesses who need liquidity now, either in loans or overdrafts. They might be expanding the business, a fleet of cars might have had to be recalled or anything. It could be that they need new storage space like right now. There were other newer loan companies at the time who were sort of springing up, the likes of Prosper and Nimble. They were offering much speedier loans with much higher interest rates. So while they were able to get the agreed loan or overdraft that day, they were paying almost double in interest in some points, which obviously for a small business is going to be really challenging because at some point you have to pay that back with interest. So our question here, after doing some initial focus grouping, was how do we combine speed and efficiency with a bank that people trust? And so our hypothesis really was that instead of just saying, okay, we're going to digitize the PDF that's already been sent, we'll just, we'll just replicate all the fields. People wanted something a bit different. People wanted something closer to what Prosper and Nimble were offering. It felt like a more personable, easy to understand approach, but without all the feeling that they were hiding something from you. We were trying to make our process as transparent as possible. At every single point of the journey, we're letting users know that, okay, if you're not eligible for such a thing, we would put you onto such a thing if you so needed it. The idea was to offer something quick and conversational, hold the customer's hand throughout the journey, and easily funnel out users who otherwise would have been eligible for an ANZ product of some kind. So a good example would be agricultural workers. They've got a very strong agricultural basis in Australia. A lot of their fruit and veggies is produced in Australia itself. It's pretty self-sufficient in that sense. But because it's such a big business and a big market, they have their own separate wing in ANZ just for agricultural transactions and business. So we'd refer them to a different ANZ service if that were the case. We wouldn't just shoehorn them into this, go, great, you need a combine harvester, you can get $100,000, off you go. When there's so many stipulations and rules in place that mean the two businesses are completely different. So while I was at ANZ, it had I always wanted to use this meme, by the way. So it's got the what I call like the triumvirate. It's got your pair writing with the designer. It's got a content focused approach, and it's got regular focus grouping and research sessions. And by that I mean regular focus grouping and research sessions, at least one every couple of weeks, usually 2 or 3 within that time. So it was really good to iterate something, get it in front of people quickly, get their feedback, go back to the drawing board, keep doing that basically. And as I was saying before, we kind of worked in a bubble, me, a designer, and a researcher, kind of pulling other stakeholders in from the business when we needed them. For example, legal, compliance, risk, that kind of thing. So this was what we ended up coming up with as an initial hypothesis. It's called a natural language question. So it works almost like fill in the blank. So if you have some empty fields where you've got Mr. Jake Kraweckyj, the sentence before it says, "Hi, my name is, my business is registered as a business," and then you select sole trader from the drop down. Its primary activity is a free fill field where you can type in your business, and keywords would come and match it up with what's in the system already. And that also meant you could get through multiple questions in 1 or 2 sentences. It was something that ANZ hadn't really tried before, but it was something I was really keen to give a go myself. We'd only seen examples, I think, with the likes of Wix, the website maker, like the website template company. They have something very similar when you're setting up your website for the first time. There's a couple of insurance companies in America that use the same sort of thing, but there's not many examples of this. So we were kind of treading new ground, especially in finance. So a good example here is like, with the primary need for these funds is for, you could select from a list of overheads. It could be overheads, it could be expand your business, it could be transport, it could be all different things. And these funds will help my business. And that this was more focused on sort of marketing to those users further down the line, not just leaving them with a loan, but saying, okay, well, if you need anything else, this is where we can direct you, kind of thing. But a really interesting thing we could do here, which you don't normally get to do on forms, is add some red herrings in. So a really good example would be the primary need for these funds is for paying tax. A loan is a really, really bad way to pay off tax or debts or anything like that, because naturally it'll just get you into more debt because you have to pay the interest back. If people chose that, then we'd stop them in the journey, we'd funnel them to our financial aid team, and they would take the conversation up from there with all of the details they've given saved up already. And the plan was, with this conversational style, you get the personal touch without the ANZ banker being there with you, and you get a conditional offer in up to just 25 minutes. So, yes, there were a couple of sticking points though. And it was really interesting to see, because we initially put users through this whole journey, and they got to a certain point where it would then calculate the results. Because this was a prototype, it was like an initial sort of loading screen just to sort of separate the filling in of information and then receiving of information. But this is instantaneous. If you meet these criteria, you just click a button and it will show you the results straight away. But in testing, we found that people would click calculate, they click calculate, they'd wait a second, and it would come up with the results, and they'd click it again. And they kept doing it. We were asking them, well, why are you doing that? And they said to us, well, it's not had time to think. Which is really interesting. When we were trying to create this personalized approach for, having like an ANZ banker in the room, you'd expect a bit of a delay between entering your results and entering your figures and receiving your results. So what we actually had to do, we had to create an artificial wait section of about 10 or 15 seconds. Even though it was automated, everything's meant to be now, as sort of leading UX research would have you believe that people want instantaneous stuff, but we had to create positive friction, basically, of putting about a 15-second delay, calculating your results, pulling through your profit and loss, working out your financials, just so people wouldn't keep clicking the button expecting the results straight away. It's a really, really interesting thing. And then there's another one here around diversifying your business, which is a term that our legal team thought that users would understand absolutely fine, because it's used in tax parlance, it's really common that diversifying your business is meant to mean expanding your portfolio into other fields that they weren't in before. So for example, Jake's Cakes, I bought a shoe company, then it would be Jake's Shoes. That would be a separate entity. I'd be diversifying my portfolio. However, not everybody knew what that was. We were dealing with small businesses. And as a result, we'd get some people saying to us, I've heard the word diverse before. Does it mean anything to do with like unconscious bias training? And that wasn't the case at all. That would be a very strange question to ask in a loan application as well. But it was the first thing they thought of. They'd heard that word in a different context. So it was great going back to the legal team and saying to them, well, look, at this point, we thought that our users would understand that. But it turns out in this context, we actually had more questions than we had answers. So we came up with this. And I'm really happy with this because it just literally explains everything as clearly as possible. In the last 12 months, my business has or has not entered into an industry that it didn't operate in before. And it just really cuts through any ambiguity there. If you know what diversifying your business is, you'll know that that's what it means. If you don't know the term, you'll still know what it means. It caters for both audiences that way. So I moved to Sage in January last year. Actually, I've just finished a year with Sage now. So I picked Sage because I was used to kind of working by myself as the only content designer in the team, and that can be good, but it can also mean that you sort of reach a ceiling where you're a bit like, I kind of want to learn more and I kind of want to get stuck into bigger projects, but you're not really able to because you've been brought in to either do like one big project or to chip away at tiny little bits as like in HMRC's case, what they call live services. So I wanted to be part of a larger content design team, get a really clear understanding of the content design process, and crucially work with a team where everyone in content design had read the book Content Design by Sarah Winters. And there's lots of different products to work on. And the best bit is we're working with other content designers in tandem. We're working together as a group. We have regular huddles every week. We get together, show off our work. It's really cool. So we work with wider UX by pair writing with them, as I mentioned before, introducing that as a concept to some of the designers. They hadn't actually worked in this way before now. Design and content. We have weekly meetings with research. We get together. We talk about what sessions are coming up, what we want to know, what we're really struggling with in our sort of day-to-day writing and designing for this particular product. It's really good when you're kind of stuck in a rut to put them in front of users and see basically how they imagine it and kind of how they interpret what you've done. It can really sort of free you up. So the research team works with us to set up these regular testing sessions as well, and we sit in where we can, take notes, and crucially, we ask questions. So a good example of this here is the very first project I worked on as part of Sage. It's the client management onboarding. Client management is a new product that's meant to take over an old product called Partner Edition. That doesn't really mean much to me and you, but to accountants, this is a way of organizing all of the clients and contacts. So by individuals, by organizations, you can put the two together in kind of a folder together. But because it's a new sort of software and a piece of technology, we would need to talk them through it. So this is where I came in, explaining very briefly every single part of the client folder, including the folder, the client list, where you can see all of the client folders together, and then actually how to get started. And the aim of the game was to give as clear instructions as possible and give them a chance to view later if they needed memory refreshing. So as part of this, there's been a couple of sticking points. So in client management, you can add organizations to a client folder or to individuals. Or individuals to it, sorry. So going back to that example of Jake's Cakes, Jake's Cakes is the company or the organization. I'm the individual, Jake Kraweckyj. You can do my self-assessment as an accountant, classed as an individual, while also doing my organization's accounts and keep the two separate, but keep them together sort of contextually in the same folder. You can set both up as a client, or you can set an individual up as a client's contact. There's all these different things you can do. But the really interesting bit here is that people didn't understand in testing that it was the same like fly out menu we just split in half for what we consider to be convenience. Organizations and individuals sit on the left hand side, but in a row. So organizations are on top, individuals are on the bottom. When we asked users to go into the design to look for these, they were looking specifically at a side-by-side comparison of organizations and individuals, and it took them ages to find it. They found organizations and they're going, well, where's the rest of it? It's like, well, no, that's it. You just scroll down. It wasn't particularly clear to users that they did have to scroll, which I found really interesting, that was something, even as from like a visual perspective, that people would really kind of find tricky. So we talked a little bit about sticking points, and so far some of these have been pretty like pretty simple fixes. There's things we are able to do, like for example, diversifying your business, change some of the language with that screenshot of the onboarding I just showed you. You know, sort of rejig it so it visually flows with how it would on the actual design itself. But there's so much more we can do for much bigger projects and much more I'd say more confusing projects and more like complex projects than just getting the researchers in. And this is what I want to talk about a bit today. It's not going against or away from research by doing some of your own research with their help, of course. It's expanding the research and focusing on that from a content perspective or from a design perspective. And a really good way of doing that when basically when you're looking at a project and you're like, what am I going to do next? A really good way of getting out of that rut is empathy mapping. So the reason I've got a picture of an older gentleman on here looking through like plexiglass is because as part of a course I did in April, we had a go at empathy mapping in like a safe environment. We envisioned the user case was this guy called Terry, and he'd just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And it was part of an interview which had been taken on by the Content Design London team on behalf of the NHS. It was part of a discovery session where they talked to Terry, I've changed the name, about his diabetes and how he found out about it and basically his life so far. And he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. He said that the symptoms kind of crept up on him. They got told to go to the GP, so he did. And we found it really interesting that it was his partner who told him to go. He wouldn't have gone himself, even though he knew something wasn't right. And he was told a lot of information in a very short time that he didn't process. He was only in there for 5 or 10 minutes, given a handful of leaflets and said, right, off you go kind of thing. This is it. Yep, see ya. He got back in his car and just sat there going, well, what just happened there? He had more questions than answers when he got home. And when his partner asked him what had gone on, he said, I've got type 2 diabetes, but I don't really know what that is. All he'd heard was horror stories of people who'd suffered with it, lost limbs, that kind of thing, lost vision, had to be on very, very strict diets. And it was up to his wife, again, to sort of step in and help him find online support. So we found it really interesting that when listening to the interview, how much he was worried and how much he was fearful, but how little he felt able to do anything. So I just want to show you this very quickly. So we'd split up the discussion he had with one of the content design team into positive, neutral, and negative emotions. And every point where we heard him say something specifically like I was concerned, or I felt ratty, or I was confused by such a thing, I'm mildly aware, I still feel ill-informed, and I'm still concerned. We would put that in here as part of almost like a narrative, so you could see where his emotional state was at certain points. Now you can see right here that none of the emotions he has are particularly positive. They're neutral at best. We also chose the word foolhardy, but we couldn't think of a better word on the day. We're thinking more like not reckless, but someone who is a bit laissez-faire. Will kind of put it to the back of his mind, kind of thing. But like I say, we couldn't think of something better on the day. And that's interesting that his emotional state was better pre-diagnosis than it was post. So you can see here that he's initially concerned, he's confused, feeling ratty, he hasn't slept very well, all this kind of thing. But now, after the diagnosis, he's mildly aware of what's going on. He still feels really uninformed. Now he's scared and he's in disbelief and he's trying to process everything. He's overwhelmed and feels alone as well. And he's also got this whole thing of concern, which really is the opposite of what you'd want from going to the doctors. So what our job was then was to split these up into user needs. So if you're not familiar with user needs or with user stories or job stories, it's a way of content designers specifically to make sense of what we just seen. So in this interview, we spent a lot of time thinking about Terry's emotional state, and then trying to map that into something more tangible. So we use a template of as I need, so I can. So as someone who's been recently diagnosed with diabetes, I need to understand the diagnosis in my own language so I can come to terms with how it'll affect my life. So that's a good starting point for us. Not necessarily to have an answer straight away for the solution we're going to use, but it gives us a kicking off point to go right. Well, whatever form this is going to take, these are the things that we need to tick off. He's been recently diagnosed. He needs to understand it in his own language and he can come to terms with it. Our job now is to help him accept what's going on and understand it. So a few examples of this is helping Terry in a way that isn't just putting him in a GP's office and giving him a load of leaflets. So pre-diagnosis, that could look like leaflets through his door, at-home diabetes tests for at-risk individuals, posters at the GP practice, billboards outside work, social media campaigns, that kind of thing. And even Netflix series about diabetes, which is probably the diciest one on there, really. There's a lot of poetic license you can take, which might hinder the case. But post-diagnosis wise, he came away from the doctors with more questions than he did answers. It would have been good maybe for the GP or whoever got to see him to give him access to support groups, offer membership to gyms, whether that's discounted or reduced, advice for a dietitian, meet up groups with other diabetes patients and success stories on management as well. So he wasn't just sat there thinking, oh, I'm going to lose a foot over this. So going back to all of this, we kind of talked through empathy mapping. We talked about Terry's situation, and we've talked about generally how content design, research can be used for good. So how do we sort of do that? How should we work basically? And a part of that, to get proper results and to stop us getting in a rut and kind of questioning everything um, before we have like any tangible answers, is to have clearly defined sprints, have writers, designers, and researchers working together, have dev, brand, and marketing involved early on as well. So we're at least aware of when we do empathy mapping and we sort of get this idea of someone's emotional state in whatever situation that might be, we know how we can talk to them. That's also called channel mapping. That's a separate thing again. And ideally, a stream lead or scrum master to organize every team. Because I'm sure some of you who are in the field already know how difficult it can be to organize meetings that you then need to go to, kind of thing. Iteratively as well. That's kind of how we should be working to get out of that rut and to stop basically asking ourselves questions that we don't have answers to and trying like spiraling into this thing of, oh, we're not good enough, we're not doing everything right. All designs and content before user research is a first draft. That's all it can be. There was a really interesting quote I heard a couple of years ago now when I was on a panel in Australia. Well, not on a panel, sorry. I went to see a panel in Australia from, I think she was called Denny Lee Stanbridge. And she worked for Vision Australia at the time as a sighted individual working to design things for people without the ability to see. And her whole approach was, I go into testing to see how wrong we are as quickly as possible. And that really stuck with me because a lot of the times you'll see in UX teams, you'll come out of a research session going, see, I told you that worked. And that's kind of the opposite approach we should take. If everything's going swimmingly, alarm bells should be ringing because we're not our users. We're the voice of them. And, we're always there to try and improve their experience, but we can't just do that alone. We've really got to see how they interpret it and really test the boundaries of that, I suppose. But yeah, Research should regularly also meet with content design to define user research goals and questions to ask and sort of areas we should focus on. And I'm glad to say Sage is getting better at this. Even in the year I've been here now, we're working much closer with designers. We're working much closer with research. It's not uncommon for us to just be all in a meeting together and just hammer out what exactly it is we've done or are about to do and what it is we need from research and vice versa. It's really good. And as before, things we need to consider as writers, designers, researchers, that kind of thing. Before testing, everything we do is a first draft. And you yourself are never the user, but you're always going to be the voice of them or the representative of them in some way. And for those who've worked in advertising before or studied it, this isn't advertising at all. You get more than one shot at a project. Consumer attention or consumer focus isn't really going to drastically change if you don't get it quite right the first time. I think that's the most important part. I used to work in advertising, and it's very much like, okay, you got one go at this, and it better be right, sort of thing. So there's questions to ask yourself, really, is how, rather than just saying, how could I not know my audience? You start thinking, how do I get to know them? How do I get to understand them? For example, am I a good writer or designer? Well, no, it's more how do you write or design for them in the way that I know they'll appreciate. Start thinking about questions to actually ask these users. Do empathy mapping, see when they're feeling at the worst, do your best to put their mind at ease, whatever's causing that. How do we tell we're getting it right after go live rather than will we ever get it right? Well, of course, but it's about telling when you're getting it right rather than veering off into something else. And you can do that by talking to your researchers, your customer support teams, your BAs, find out what people are calling in about. We had a really interesting meeting before where at Sage where the most popular help pages are considered some of the most successful. Whether the opposite is true, because the more people that are going to visit those pages means that something needs to be fixed. It's sort of flipping that approach, really, just going, oh, will we ever get it right? Well, how will you get it right is the thing. Who do you ask? Who do you talk to? What do people generally struggle with when using your product? And the most important question, of course, is this presentation finished? Yes, yes, it is. Thank you.
Amazing. Jake, many thanks for that. It was a brilliant overview on your experience, your journey, your learnings. Also the UX of content, when content fails, how UX teams work, case studies, enhancing user experience through research and design. A brilliant talk. And guys, feel free to gather your thoughts, your questions and comments in the chat. I can see a few coming through now as well. And as usual, if you want to go live and interact with Jake with questions and sentiments, feel free to do that as well. Jake, the first question coming through from Zoe is, what has been your most favorite thing about working in a team of designers? Is it something that you now can't live without?
Yep, sorry, I'll just stop sharing my screen a moment. Yep. So I'd probably say that it's something I've touched on in the session a couple of times already, is that I couldn't live without pair writing now. It's a content design approach that was introduced by Sarah Winters, usually formerly known as Sarah Richards, and it's basically you get together and you just hash out how the whole thing should work. Really, it's all well and good writing content for something or designing for something, but when you're designing with someone or writing content with someone, you're always bouncing ideas off one another. It's genuinely one of my favorite parts of the job. Any chance I get to do it, I'll do. And you find how much you get done in an hour or even an hour and a half compared to playing like email tennis, really. You could send something to your designer, they could send something back, they could send it to the researcher, or you could just go, look, let's just all get in a room and a virtual room, whatever, and figure this out and actually write it and design it together. It's brilliant. It's a really good feeling when you all sort of like click, you all kind of align with what the best method would be based on all your own individual sort of disciplines. It's a great feeling. If you work with content designers or UX designers or writers, try it as soon as you can. It's brilliant. It's a really good feeling.
Amazing. Another question from Zoe as well is, what is a piece of advice you would give to someone starting out in Sage or another design job that you wish that you were given?
So I touched on my advertising experience before, and the reason I got out of advertising is because a few years ago now, I started off in this. I'm not gonna lie, it was a pretty toxic environment, really. It was a smallish ad agency, where I was brought in as the junior copywriter and treated as just the junior. Sort of like any boring copy tasks they wanted me to do, they'd get me to do them. And when I say boring, it was like, right, replace this paragraph with this one. You're not doing it quick enough, that kind of thing. And it was quite strange being micromanaged and being basically being told exactly how to do it, but left to just then do it rather than working collaboratively with someone and trying to get their focus on, what is the right way. So it caused a lot of friction. It caused quite a lot of difficulty. It meant a lot of long hours with very difficult people, and yeah, it wasn't the best time. So when I moved into UX, I still had some of that mindset with me. And my head of design, head of UX, who was from a UX design background, um, took me for my first like one-to-one session, and he sat me down and he said, "I noticed that you're quite shy in offering suggestions." I said, "Yeah, that's right." And he goes, "Can I ask why?" So I told him a very abridged version of what I just told you. And he said to me, "Well, I've hired you because of what you're able to do. I've hired you because of your brain. I've hired you because you're going to go into there with as much information as you have at the time and give the best solution that you can think of at that point. If research comes back and says, well, actually, this would have worked better, at least you know that and you can go back and iterate. You're not just doing it once and that's it." And that was a really big thing for me. In UX, you are hired for what you can do, whereas in things like advertising and marketing, you kind of you kind of recruited for what you have done. It's a really strange one. I suppose that would be the big one. It's like, make sure that you're in the room with um, other designers and just working collaboratively as much as you can.
Yes.
And there's another question there as well.
Another question coming through from Tarek. Yeah, what's one advice to people who are still to pursue a career in UX design?
So I was just taking a sip of water there. So I suppose it depends on the stage you're at. If you're looking to pursue a career, you're looking to move over from another discipline into UX design. I can only speak from like a UX writing or content design basis on that one, but don't be afraid to put your CV out there and to build up a portfolio, even if you don't have any sort of tangible clients or anything like that yet. People are really interested in seeing how you think rather than what you already know, and that's a really refreshing thing. My first UX job, like I say, I moved in from advertising and marketing, that kind of world, but I was working with another UX writer who had studied ancient Greek at uni. There was another guy who was he was like a qualified PI and also did like journalism stuff on the side. So it was a really interesting mix because we'd all come with very different disciplines. Like, one on paper, you'd look and you go, how would that work? But it did, because we were really incisive and we knew about the craft of writing. We knew when to ask the right questions. That's probably what I'd say. So don't be afraid of putting your CV and your portfolio out there, because people want to see how you think, and make sure um, when you do make a decision, how to back that up with rationale and evidence and things like that. That would be my advice. Defend your decisions as much as you can.
Amazing. And building on that as well, what resources would you recommend to students if they wanted to get into UX? Like what to do in terms of how to prepare folios, where to look for jobs and positions? What would you recommend?
That's a really good one. So if you go on, I think it's on LinkedIn. I think is it called UX Writers Collective or the UX Writing Hub? I'm coming at this from a UX writing thing, but it wouldn't hurt to actually get in touch with some UX designers that you admire. If you're on a website and you're impressed with the way they've handled something and the way they've managed it, and you want to know more about it, you can usually find those designers on LinkedIn. Try getting in touch and even say something like, "Look, I really enjoyed what you did here. You don't necessarily have to like talk me through it, but just if anything's kind of coming up, or you want to know more about me, just let me know, that kind of thing. I know that sounds really old school. It's like you're almost just walking into a shop with an armful of CVs, but the reality of it is that, UX writers, I look at some people's work and I'm really admire it. And sometimes I do reach out, and even if I'm not looking for work or something, I'll just say, "Oh, hi, I saw this, by the way, and I just thought it was really cool." Um, and sometimes it leads to a conversation. Sometimes it doesn't. They're like, "Oh, cool, thanks." Other times they're like, "Oh, great. Well, I'd love 5 minutes to just chat to you." Another really good way is to try and get on. I think I'll find the link. I'm mentoring a couple of content designers, UX writers at the moment with the UX Writing Hub or Collective. That's a really handy way of getting your process out there as well, and it's really good practice because they're putting sort of like live briefs in front. Well, not live briefs, but complex briefs in front of you and seeing how you would approach it, and you know all that kind of thing. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's a brilliant response, actually.
Oh, cool, thanks.
And building on from that, like, what's your day like as a UX content creator and writer? And like, what does the role of a UX writer entail?
So I've touched on it already about pair writing, getting together with designers and researchers to focus on a specific aspect of a design, whether that's even a page or in some cases like a tick box or a modal that pops up or an overlay. That could take us a couple of hours to really hash it out. I'd like to say that was all of my day, because I really do like that. There's a lot of the stuff I do is more focused on, especially at the moment, we're getting things together from like a consistency standpoint. So when I first joined, there was no real consistency in error messages, for example. They had no kind of like clear tone. There was no real way to standardize them, because the idea was anyone who needed an error writing would kind of write it, post it online, and in fact, one of them got a bit of it didn't get like negative feedback, but it was needlessly complex. Um, and so it was up to us to then go, okay, this is what they're trying to say in this paragraph of text. All someone needs to know is that something's down, we're fixing it as quickly as possible, come back later. Whereas this whole thing was like a paragraph like, we're sorry to have to tell you this, da da da. So I took it upon myself to create like a glossary, or a source of truth, if you like, with one of the design teams. So we had a consistent tone across all errors. A lot of the times it is just because of a minor fault that you have to try again. It could be plant maintenance, so we need to think of something for that. A little bit like the HMRC or gov.uk design libraries and style guides, that kind of thing we're trying to replicate. So a lot of my day at the moment is looking in spreadsheets, adding in error content, error content, and just that kind of thing. Cool.
Amazing. And then what's a typical process like on a UX writing project?
So typically, I touched on it a little bit with the ANZ process, but it's having an understanding of what the focus is, kind of what the product is aiming to do, the emotional state of the users themselves. In the case of the ANZ one, people were frustrated because they wanted money quickly, but didn't want the hassle of paying extra interest, that kind of thing, and going with a bank they trusted, kind of thing. So the process is mainly designers, writers, and researchers kind of getting together in a little bubble to actually work on designs together, get key questions asked out the way early, that kind of thing, and to just try and sort of structure it all. It kind of depends on the process, really. It depends on the product, but that's how we like to work mostly.
Amazing. And that's leads on to Carlos's question. So Carlos Ariel is asking, which skills do you think are really useful from your experience then?
So I've always said that my job's a lot like, it's like 50% writing and 50% lateral thinking or philosophy kind of thing. It's a lot of really sitting down and stretching an idea out to its as far as it can go, basically. So I'm trying to think of an example. So it could even be like as simple as there's a button on a page that someone's looking to sign up for something. So you could go, okay, well, they could click that button and we could tell them everything they need to sign up right then and there. But what do they know about it already? Do they know what this product's actually for? Are they expecting something else? Do we describe what it actually does correctly? What do they need to know before this? Do they need to be eligible for certain things? Are they ineligible, which means they can't sign up? What happens if that's the case? That kind of thing. So for our perspective, it's a lot of lateral thinking. So generally, not being afraid to ask questions is a good one, and not being afraid to think kind of laterally, and I don't want to say outside the box, it's a bit cliche, but looking at something and going, wait a minute, I'm not entirely sure how this works. I will go and ask someone, even if it's the most obvious question in the world, or so you might think. You could pose it to someone and they're like, oh yeah, no, of course, you're absolutely right. That might not necessarily mean this to this user. It might mean that. A good example is the diversifying your portfolio thing. If we didn't ask users what that meant, or we didn't question it at all, we'd have just put that in and we'd have had a very, very small fraction of people thinking that meant something to do with unconscious bias training when it really didn't. Just stuff like that. Always asking the right questions. Asking the right questions, asking questions in general, tugging at those strings and seeing what happens really.
Mhm. And then in terms of user testing, I know you spoke about empathy mapping and so forth. Like how much user testing do you guys do? And well, at what scale do you do the user testing before you kind of deploy the final kind of UX?
So I believe we go through a good few rounds. I think it's something like 3, maybe 4 rounds per product.
Mhm.
And each of those rounds has 5 or 6 participants in them. So that's considered qualitative research rather than quantitative. The idea being that um, you're on a Teams call with, especially right now, you're on a Teams call with an accountant who's using the product for the first time. They're not 100% sure like how to use it straight away. So, you'll watch them kind of move around and look at things and try and gain reference and context. So that's really good. It's really good to actually see that. Um, so yeah, I'd like to do more of that. Just generally speaking, I think that's been a case everywhere I've worked. It's not just Sage specific. It's really good working with a larger research team. Um, but yeah, I, I, I think whatever research you could do, there's always a little bit more you could do.
No, maybe.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And then building on that as well, like in terms of research, design, user testing, like what maybe is your favorite toolkit in terms of like methods, frameworks for user experience? Like if there's any methods or methodologies that you particularly like or can recommend.
So one thing I would recommend, and I think any content designer would recommend this too, is have a read of the book, if you haven't already, Content Design by Sarah Richards, or Sarah Winters now. It's fantastic. So Sarah Winters basically devised the whole concept of content design, which is kind of a step up from UX writing. I think it's really good for designers and researchers to read as well, because you get to see kind of how we think, and kind of the questions we ask, and like sort of the strings we pull to kind of unravel the whole thing. um, but yeah, it's a really really good read. That would be my number one suggestion, because it gives you ideas of how to basically how to plot out stuff like empathy mapping, but also user stories, user needs, job stories, that sort of thing, which are really broken down in the book, and kind of explained as to how useful they are. And it generally just gives you really good advice on content. Anyway, yeah, that's the one. Thank you. But yeah, highly recommend. Yeah, any more questions?
Yeah, there's just a couple left. One of those is like in terms of yourself, what's your most favorite UX work or precedents that you like, are really inspired by or really enjoyed when you saw them, or and also any other portfolios or websites or digital platforms that really inspire you in terms of work?
That's a really good question. I'm always really impressed by. I don't know if it says more about me than the organizations and companies that I that I look at, but I'm always really impressed with like elements of UX that seem almost imperceptible. So a really good example I use quite often is Netflix. So Netflix have a really, really good like research and design team. But the things I like the best about Netflix isn't necessarily that you got like the watch something button, which is kind of like in your face, or that, you know, it's got like the top 10 recommended, the kind of things. It's the little subtle things. So one of them is if you leave a Netflix episode of something midway through, I don't know, you need to put the cat out or you need to go and put the dinner on or something like that. You come back to it 30 minutes later, what it'll do is it'll go back 10 seconds automatically. So it keys you back into where you were. That's a brilliant bit of like UX, in my opinion. It's almost imperceptible, but you probably sat there a couple of times and you thought, I've heard that sentence before. It's because you have. It's leading you back into where you were rather than just going mid sentence, just like, you know, it's just throwing you back in. It takes you back that little bit, little things like that. Another really good example, and it wasn't necessarily a good user experience. It was with Yodel. I've just, as of yesterday, I had my router. I had to go pick up my router in the end. They didn't deliver it, but on the delivery function, I found it really interesting that when you're filling out all the details about when you want it delivered, if you're not in, what to do, that kind of thing, they had a section saying, who do you want it delivered to? Which neighbor do you want it delivered to if you're not in? And you can choose from, you know, A, B, or C. And then it gives you a list of who do you want us to avoid, which I thought was really interesting. It's clear that there's been some user research going on in there where they've actually asked users, look, you know, how do you feel about this? And they've probably gone, yeah, I don't think I'd want Jake to to pick it up. It's that kind of thing. I just found that really interesting, and I don't know. I like to find my inspiration from UX in like loads of random little places. I couldn't just say, oh, I love this company's work or this company's work wholeheartedly. It's all the little things that interest me.
Now that's superb actually, and some really nice little examples of different interactions and UX kind of implementations there that, you know, that can obviously the students can use it as an example and follow up on those particular leads as well. Yeah, because sometimes, like, you know, you just enjoy those little micro interactions, you know, like you mentioned, in terms of, you know, recontextualizing what you're watching in that particular, you know, going back 10 seconds or so to kind of put you back in that particular scene and then continuing watching and stuff like that. Just those are kind of like quite joyous little interactions that, you know, takes a lot of consideration of design and implementation. And then on that particular note, obviously, as we have a lot of designers, product designers, design engineers as well, who work across electronics, robotics, mechatronics, we've got product design engineering students as well. What are your thoughts on physical versus digital user experience?
Oh, that's a good one. Generally speaking, I think the two, you can't have one without the other. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but you know, it's all about, you could have the best digital experience in the world, like, you know, I was saying before about Yodel. If they still don't deliver it on time, and you know, I'm still waiting for my router 3-4 days later, that physical experience is not good. I won't be sat there thinking, oh well, that digital experience was excellent. There's so much about consistency across both, and that's kind of what we tried to do when I was at ANZ. We tried to replicate the personality of not necessarily a personality of an ANZ banker, but just generally more conversational, something like that. So it wouldn't feel like you're just doing that alone. And ANZ are known for their customer service. Actually, they're pretty highly regarded in Australia for that. And I'm not just saying it because I have friends who work in that field, but it's pretty accurate. Like they're usually known for getting to the bottom of things and going that little bit extra, and rewarding their contact center staff with promotions and things like that, sort of recognition where recognition is due, for that exact reason. And that one couldn't happen without the other. If we had a really great user experience that would get you a digital experience that would get you the loan and overdraft in 25 minutes conditionally, and it took 2 weeks for someone on the other end to just press a button and go, yeah, that's fine, then that's still no good. Yeah, I think the two things have to marry up so much. And yeah, I think that's my answer in short.
Amazing. That's brilliant, actually. And guys, any other thoughts, questions, comments? Feel free to populate that in the chat. And definitely look at the book Jake recommended, the Content Design book by Sarah Winters. And I think, Jake, I think that's pretty much it in terms of the questions coming through. So, Jake, it was fantastic to have you this evening. Thanks a lot for taking out your time, joining us tonight. Brilliant talk and Q&A session. Thanks a lot.
Good stuff. Thanks for having me. And it's good to meet you all.
Amazing. So, guys, the details of the talk and Jake was sent to your emails ahead of the talk, including links to Jake's website and LinkedIn as well. Definitely feel free to browse and connect. And to all the participants, attendees who've joined tonight, staff, students, alumni, guests, we really look forward to seeing you guys all next week again. So keep an eye out on your emails for the details of the next speaker and links to the next talk. And until next week, guys, stay well, stay safe, and thank you all.